Okay, guys, just a few housekeeping things first. It's going to run for about an hour. David will speak for 40 minutes, and then you've got 20 minutes to ask him a few questions. If you have got questions, you can use the podium mics at the sides of the auditorium. Okay, so here he is, David McWilliams at Google.
Get the whole thing started. Well, listen, it's really nice to be here, and I'd say we've been intimidated actually to be here too as well, on the basis that this company has done so much in the last couple of years, which has kind of changed most of our lives. I certainly couldn't write books without Google, so thank you very much. And all your search engines, it's always very good to just cut and paste and download. But so I swear I came up with that idea. It was all my own, right? So thank you all in advance for the royalties that come. No, but. And also this book that I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to talk about other things as well. This book, Follow the Money, has come in for a lot of strange attention over the last couple of weeks, which was kind of unintended. But that's sometimes, I suppose, something that you just have to deal with in the course of doing things in Ireland. I'm going to talk mainly about Ireland, but I'm going to broaden it out, obviously, because the audience is much more international than the audience, for example, I spoke last night in Limerick. And it was much more of a local event. I'm lucky to get out alive, but sure, here I am, so it's grand. But no, I'm only joking. But just by way of, I was just kind of saying a little bit of housekeeping. Just please do make sure that your mobiles are switched off. And the reason I say this is a couple of weeks ago, about 2 months ago, amazingly, one of the Irish banks let me in, which is kind of unusual. I'm rather their enemy number one. And I was discussing at the board level what I thought was going to happen. I'd written that I thought one of the big banks was going to be nationalised. And all the banks were, no, it's not going to be nationalised. That can't possibly happen. And I said, well, you have no money, and that's what kind of happens. And but I was down one end of the board, right? And there was the chief investment officer, right? And all his cronies on the other end. And I was kind of a lone voice, and I was giving the argument about nationalisation, and they were giving very good arguments back, and I was giving the argument, they were giving the argument there. And then suddenly you realize the argument's going away from you. You're beginning to lose the argument, and you can feel yourself going to a hole. And just as he was about to give his killer point, the chief investment officer of one of our biggest banks, his mobile phone rang. And the ringtone was, "Don't You Want Me Baby" by the Human League. Result. I said, thank you very much. You'll never work in this town again. So what I'm saying is sometimes some things you download onto your phones that in the privacy of your own car might be a guilty pleasure, sound really naff when they go off in public. So just to save you from potential embarrassment amongst your peers, please just hit the mobile phones. The other thing I'd like to talk about is, my own experience from working. What I want to talk about is in Ireland. It might be a little bit strange in Google, but in Ireland we have a tradition here that when somebody or a company or an individual or group of individuals arrives with a new idea, those ideas go through 3 phases. The first phase is open ridicule. Okay? Right? You are undermined, besmirched, laughed at, and really held up to be a complete idiot. That's the first phase. Then the second phase in Ireland is violent opposition to both you and the idea. Okay? And that can manifest itself in an amazing array of ways. And as I've suffered from this over the years, I'm quite aware of it now. And then the third thing in Ireland is the universal acceptance phase. Right? Where the idea is ridiculed then it's violently opposed, and then it's the taxi driver says, well, we all knew the property was going to fall. Oh, Jesus, absolutely. No, you thought you were on your own, man, but I knew it, right? And so did all my mates down the submarine, right? So that is what happens in Ireland with ideas, right? It doesn't happen in Google, because Google's a big place full of mad ideas and things like that. But that's an important thing, because when you write books or when you stand up on television, you make TV programs, whatever, you do it because you're involved in the idea, right? And the idea is what drives you forward, and it's the idea that actually changes the world, and it's the idea that changes the country. So this is why, people like me tend to get up and write these books every couple of years. But I just want to also make one point about that's the phase of ideas. The other phase of ideas in Ireland, okay, and maybe all over the world, but particularly here, is there is no alternative. Okay? That we are hearing at the moment in our economy with respect to the banks, with respect to cutbacks, with respect to everything. Anybody who articulates a counter view, a counter-cyclical view, or a counter-thinking view says there is no alternative. The mandarins are right, and ultimately the civil service is right. And to argue with the civil service means you're being unpatriotic, which is another great Irish thing. See what happened to poor Thierry Henry. Forget all that, be nice to bloody Frenchmen and all that sort of thing. You can't do that, Thierry, or with the left paw. Anyway, so I just want to talk about these big ideas because, and I'll put it by way of a story, which many years ago, and it's really, the important thing is that the system can be wrong. This is what I'm saying. And if the system is proved to be wrong, what tends to happen is the system attacks the person who says they're wrong because they believe that by admitting you're wrong, you undermine yourself. Whereas I always believe by admitting you're wrong and mistakes, you actually learn something. And our society is in this phase where the battle for ideas is pivotal now for where this country goes for the next couple of years. And I'll tell you, years ago, when I was about the age of most of the people here, I worked in the Central Bank of Ireland as an economist in 1992. And in 1992, this country was rather different to the country that many of you have come to, and obviously most of us have lived in. And in 1992, it was very interesting, because you know the way now, I presume in Google, like, it's all, to be all kind of cool with the chief executive and kind of play softball with your manager and all that sort of nonsense, And like, hang out with the troops, and the receptionist is the best thing since sliced bread, all the usual stuff, right? You see that in corporate affairs, If it wasn't for the people, the company would be nothing, right? Which is true. But back in 1992 in Ireland, it was the opposite case, right? We had unemployment was about 16%. And the way to success wasn't to hang with the chief executive. It was to avoid the chief executive like the plague, right? To make sure that you never came into any contact with anybody in power, right? This was the key thing. And you could just meander through the civil service. I was an economist there, and I used to write articles about Europe for the governor of the bank. And just think about it now, it's quite different to Google. Like, the governor of the Bank of Ireland, the Central Bank of Ireland, was so remote from the plebs who wrote his speeches, right, that he had his own bleeding lift. So you can imagine, right? It's true. You go down there in Dave Street now, there's a little small lift like that for one or two people. And then there's a lift for all the sardines who work there, who actually write the policy. So I was always intrigued by this sort of thing. And I never met him, and that was the whole point. Was you'd write the speeches like this. You'd write a speech of this, and it would go up like in a dumb waiter, up to his floor. And you'd wait. And about 2 days later, right back down to you again. With scribbles, Osqueliga. Which is kind of difficult if you come from Dún Laoghaire. Like, Dún Laoghaire Gaeltacht didn't actually get that far, So, you also might remember, some of you who might be old enough to remember, but I don't think there's many in the room, that in 1992 we had a currency crisis in Ireland, right? That we had spent the whole of the 1980s and the early 90s pretending to the financial markets that we weren't Irish, we were actually German, right? We tied to the Deutschmark, and we said, don't worry, we're Germans, right? And we save as much as the Germans, and we're as clever as them, and our exchange rate is right, okay? And the rest of the world believed for about 3 years that we were Germans, right? But then what happened is Britain fell out of the exchange rate mechanism. You always blame the Brits, that is a default position. And, or the French now, it's all good. I love the idea. I was reading the paper. Can you imagine actually Sarkozy picking up the phone? And he's got the weight of the world, and Carla on his shoulders. And he's, sorry. Sorry, didn't say that. And it's a nice image, though. Anyway, and Brian Cowan rings him and says, it's all about the football. I just found it amazing that we were going to, but anyway, the point is, it's a funny Irish diplomacy. Anyway, so the idea back then was, we'd said we were Germans, but then, of course, the financial markets didn't believe us, and they started speculating against our currency, the punt. And the official line in Ireland was, the official line from the top was, no devaluation. Devaluation will be the worst thing we could ever possibly do, and if we did that, we would be incredible, and no money would ever come back, and the likes of Google, which wasn't created, but the likes of, let's say, Microsoft and whatever, would never come into Ireland because we would not be a credible country, and we'd be really a bunch of paddies out in the middle of the Atlantic, right? The financial markets said, we don't believe you. So what happened was we put our interest rates up. Think about this. Our interest rates went up to 102% overnight. And just think about that, right? Our currency was falling like a stone. Our reserves were falling like a stone. I was working in the bank at the time, and I was trying to avoid the governor, clearly, to get on in my life. And we're sitting there one Tuesday, and I was doing what's a very important job in the central bank, is to be the official photocopier of the Irish Times crossword, right? It's an essential part of the morning, okay, to get attuned into the competition for the day. And I'm sitting there, probably doing the cross like this, and I got this sort of, and I looked up, and there was the governor. And I thought, oh, Jesus. And he said, Mr. McWilliams, you'll be aware we are having some problems with the currency. And I felt like saying, no shit, Sherlock, Jesus Christ. He said, I would like you to go to the Dorchester Hotel in London and to discuss economics with some people from Germany and Switzerland who are portfolio managers. Do you know the Dorchester? And I said, well, what he didn't know was that my second last job but one was as a kitchen porter in the Dorchester Hotel in London. So I'd never been through the front door, but I'd been through the back door loads of times. So I said, yes, I do. And he said, would you go over there and explain that we won't devalue? And what was happening at the time was that Ireland was sending out economists to deal with portfolio managers and say, this is the policy. And I said, oh, really, the Dorchester, And I kind of looked at him, and he said, there'll be no devaluation. And I felt like saying, is that a fact, Ted? It was like sending Father Dougal out, All right, Ted, no devaluation. So, and at the time, we didn't know how to think about this now for all you Googleites. At the time, somebody mentioned something about PowerPoint. And I said, what? He said, there's a thing called PowerPoint. I think you should present the case in PowerPoint. And I looked at him and I said, okay. What in Jesus' name is PowerPoint? So we went and we did a course in PowerPoint on the Wednesday in the morning. We learned the speech. Anyway, got the whole speech ready. And we did what all economists do, right? If an economist doesn't understand what they're doing or is nervous, they revert to mathematics, okay? Just know that, right, from your university things, right? If they can't explain in simple terms what's going on, they've got all sorts of sums up on the blackboard like this, right? Because that makes them look smart. So obviously I put loads of sums in the document. And I couldn't trust the floppy disk. So I decided to print them all off, right? All 20 speeches. So I printed them all off, big things. And I wrapped it all up in a brown cardboard box, put it on the carousel, got onto Aer Lingus, in first class, when Aer Lingus had a first class, which was many years ago. And it's obviously going to be Ryanair in a couple of years, so that's a shame. But anyway, there you go. And got the box, went into the thing, and there was a big room like this. And I arrived in, and I swear, like I was riding in a suit my mammy bought me, right? And a pair of rubber shoes. I'm looking at the lads. And I said, hi, how are you? They said, hi. And there were about 17 or 18 very senior people in the room. And they kind of looked different to us at the time. When we were poor, rich people smelled different to us. Remember that? They did. It was like a different race or something, Like we were really poor and skinny. And they were all kind of full of Paquet Rabanne and stuff like that, Kind of big heavy watches on them, like watches. There's big heavy watches, but there's like 3 little watches on them. So, I don't know, you can call it an airstrike on them or something like that. Anyway, so I went up and I said, hello, just got a little speech. And I got out my box with all my speeches in it, and I looked in the box. And I looked at them, and then I looked into the box again. And I looked at them, and I looked in the box. And they started looking in the box. And in the box was not the speech, but was 6 dozen golf balls. So I said, hold, and you could just hear them saying, sell that currency, sell that country. Anyway, the long show, we made the speech, and these things happen. They all tripped out, except one guy at the very back, and I felt I was going to become a kitchen porter again, actually. I thought, that was it. My career as an economist and mathematician is all gone. And one guy sat in the back, big, huge lad, big, big, double-breasted jobby on him. And he says to me, I thought he was going to actually, cut me in two or something. And he said, very impressive. I said, oh, Jesus, thank you very much, Squire. He said, your ability to articulate economics is extraordinary. I said, well, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. He said, you have this ability to reduce technical ideas to something very simple. I said, oh, that's lovely. You're great too. You're fab, I like you already, I take you home. And he said, but your extraordinary way with words and confidence. He said, in fact, what really intrigues me is that for somebody so young and with a smile on your face looking almost angelic, your ability to lie for your country is phenomenal. I said, rumbled. Okay, fair enough. I thought I was going off to the Old Bailey at that stage. Then he looked at me and said, would you like to lie for me? And I said, warming to the conversation, I said, who are you? Now, okay, at the time, UBS was the biggest bank in Europe. And I had never heard of it, right? I thought there was 2 banks in the world, Bank of Ireland and Allied Irish, right? Couldn't tell you anything, didn't know where, right? And he says to me, as, senior chaps in these sort of banks say, he said, I am from UBS. Now, I thought the fecker said UPS, right? So I was imagining myself in one of those brown uniforms, you know, going around little van saying, sign here, please. I thought it was a promotion. And anyway, in subsequent weeks, I did start working for UBS in London and then in Russia and all over the place. But the point of the story is, what happened to Ireland? We devalued about 8 weeks later, right? Now, official Ireland said that if we devalue, number one, unemployment will rise. Inflation will rise, interest rates will rise, the budget deficit will go out of control, emigration will rise, and the country might as well saw itself off the rest of Europe and float out into the Atlantic. Off you go. That was the official line. What actually happened? Unemployment fell rapidly. A huge wall of money that was terrified about Irish policy came flooding back into the country. Interest rates fell almost by the minute. The rate of inflation didn't rise, it fell. Okay? Unemployment fell, the economy boomed. So official policy was that if we devalue, we will end up in a disastrous situation. What actually happened is we devalued and the country boomed. So what this does, it says to you that ideas and official positions can sometimes be wrong, and if they are wrong, they are catastrophically wrong. Catastrophically wrong. And in our country, this has happened. But again, those who said that we should devalue at the time were ridiculed. Then they were violently opposed. But ultimately, every single one of the people who opposed the devaluation in Ireland concluded, after the devaluation, sure, we all knew if we devalued it would be fine, right? By the way, they've all been promoted. Every single person who presided over a failed policy are now very, very senior positions in the country, right? So what I'm saying to you is always think that when ideas are first mooted, they are opposed viciously. Number one, because they threaten people. And the other side of the thing is that if a country decides to run up an intellectual cul-de-sac, as we did in the 90s, and I believe we are doing now again, what happens is we in Ireland can't admit that we're wrong, because to admit we're wrong is a bigger failure in the eyes of those who are orchestrating policy than actually doing the right thing. Now, I compare this to, there's many Irish people here. Does anybody remember their granny in the country having a good room? Right? My granny had a good room, which was so good that I wasn't good enough to go into it. Right? The good room, just to the foreigners, we'll explain. Right? The good room is an Irish concept, right? That grannies had. And I was always been intrigued by the good room when I was a kid, because I just wasn't good enough. And my ma wasn't good enough. And my dad wasn't good enough, right, to go into the good room. And what happened in my granny's house, the good room was locked. She had the key. But in the good room was kind of china that she got for a wedding present, right? Wrapped up in faded covers of the Irish independence, right? No Irish press in our bleeding house. Anyway, and there'd be delf and pictures of fictitious ancestors, which we never had. They probably bought in the market in Macroom to make us look posh, right? Okay? Because I don't think any of our ancestors were rich enough to get their photos taken in 1910. So that was it. You know, like, you know the way if you go to German houses, they've great French houses, ancestral fellas with big moustaches and shit like that, right? And we didn't have them. Or if we did, they weren't in our house. But anyway, the good room was a conceit. And the conceit of the good room was that if the local priest came, or the local doctor, or the local big farmer came, you'd bring him into the good room. And you'd pretend that you all lived in the good room. But everyone knew you didn't live in the good room. So it was a big pretense, right? So you probably pretend that we're as good as you, so you come into the good room, right? But the priest knew that we all lived out in the backyard, right, on top of each other, right? With the animals and shit like that, right? But the good room was all about a lack of self-esteem. It's a serious point. I know made light, but it's a serious point. A lack of self-esteem which percolated through the Irish psyche. So we pretended we were posher than we were, and the posh people pretended to believe us. Okay? And in so doing, the status quo of the good room remained very much part of Irish life for many years. It's gone now, right? But think about policy. Bad policy is the equivalent of the good room. We have not got the self-esteem to say at the moment, when our banks are bust, when our economy is in terrible difficulty, we haven't got the self-esteem to go to our European partners and say, we're in real trouble. And that trouble demands radical solutions. Because we are in extraordinary times here in Ireland. I actually believe we're in extraordinary times all over the world. But here in Ireland we're in extraordinary times, and that demands extraordinary solutions. But we sit in the good room pretending that everything is all right. And we're waiting for the cavalry to come over the hill. It's the something might turn up in the next 20 minutes approach to economics, right? Something hasn't turned up for quite a while. The cavalry won't turn up. Anybody who's traveled, you guys know you're in a competitive global marketplace. You know what's going on in the rest of the world. You know what other countries are doing. You know such technological advances that are going. So we are in the good room, petrified. And we have to analyze where we've got to in Ireland, but not only in Ireland, but in Britain and America. And we are in, to use the parlance of economics, a very classic liquidity trap, right? We don't want to borrow because of huge inherited debts that we took out in the last few years. The banks don't want to lend because we have now become a bigger risk. And what the banks are doing is they're taking the money from the European Central Bank, which is very nice, at 1%. The Irish government bond market is yielding 5.7% for 15-year money. So you say, I get that for free. That's 1% money from the Germans. Dankeschön, sehr Dank. Okay? And I can invest it at 5.7%, which is a 4.7% free carry without even opening the doors of the bank. So why in Jesus' name would I lend to anyone running a restaurant or a bar or a car dealership or a small company? Because it makes no sense. If I was the corporate treasurer of our big banks, I wouldn't lend either. Because I would rebuild our balance sheet internally based on a little bit of obvious financial play. So what happens is then the money that we are getting from Europe gets stuck in the banking system. We don't want to borrow as much as we did because we've got to pay back things. I think there's a moment in Ireland we have to admit one thing which is unfortunate. We don't have the money. We don't have the money to pay back the 32,000 euros that we owe per household in this country. Okay, we just don't have it. And then again, you've got to think, well, what do we spend the money on? This is the unfortunate thing. When you're on telly, you have a very, very unusual relationship with taxi drivers. Okay, I'll just tell you this so everyone chooses the career I've chosen. So you go to Dublin Airport, you know, you come back from London, and about 2 years ago this happened to me. I'd made a program about how the economy was going to really, the property market was going to crash, banks were going to crash, and it was back to the ridicule idea. You were ridiculed at the time. And I got into the taxi, and there's a dub there, and he had a huge, big Ned Kelly on him. And he had a Dublin jersey, you know, a man who thinks that blue bubble wrap is a good look, you know, and he stretch down over him like that. He's kind of kissing the castles, you know, up in the hill. And I get in and I say, hi, how are you? And he goes, oh, it's only yourself. That's me, thank you very much. He says, I seen you on the telly the other night talking through your bleeding hole. Okay. You haven't a Jesus clue what you're talking about, man. You know, well, I don't mind. The man has to earn a crust, but you haven't a bleeding clue. I said, Killarney, please. And then he said, swear you at him. We kind of warm into the conversation and having a chat, you know. Usual thing, break the ice, Robbie Keane, the usual stuff. And he said, where are you coming from? I said, London. And he was talking about the airport. He goes, I'm after just coming back myself from Kusadasi. I said, really, Kusadasi? He says, yeah. And he put his love up to the mirror, as Dublin taxi drivers do when they want to indicate numerals, okay? And he said, I'm after buying 5 gaffs just now off plants in a beautiful development in Kusadasi. The golf course is coming in 2029. And a very nice man from AIB is after financing the whole thing based on my house in the Blanche. Okay. Right, okay. Lovely people, them Greeks. Say nothing. Balkan Wars and all that stuff. Right? Now we have to pay for all that stuff now. Right? We have to pay for all that stuff. And it wasn't just this man. It was a frenzy. Another stuff we've got to pay for in Ireland, right? And this is before we get on to how Google's going to save us, so don't worry. There's an evangelical chief executive tone to the end of it. Anyway, I'm just trying to figure it out as I keep speaking. You know, like the other thing, you know, we spend on funny things in Ireland. Like, about 8 months ago, I have a friend of mine who was in college with me, and she's married to a mate of mine, and she's very, very nice, but she's got one of those very high-pitched South Dublin voices. Like talking to a bat. Like a ventriloquist or something. And I met her down Ducky, and she was chatting. Hello, dear. Would you like to come up and see my island? I said, you're what? My island. There was I thinking, Tuesday afternoon, our fella's away, you know. No, I wasn't. But it does cross your mind when you work for yourself. Anyway, so you go up to see the island, right? Now, when I was in school, when I was a kid, like an island was like the Aran Islands, or Lambay Island, or Dalkey Island. That's an island, right? So you go into this house, in a typical Dublin house, but it's all over the country. Not just Dublin, all over the country. And you walk through the door and it looks kind of normal. You're having kind of a Doctor Who TARDIS moment because you can sense something's going to go on. And you walk in and clearly an architect on far too much acid has got hold of the house and pushed back walls and has sliding this and doors and rainforest and all sorts of things in it. And so you're kind of shocked, but you're still waiting to see the island. Okay. And then you walk in to the kitchen. When did we decide that we have to have kitchens which you could land an entire platoon of American Marines in 5 Black Hawks that don't touch each other? And the yummy mummy is kind of rollerblading around. Woo, woo, woo. And you're kind of looking at her. She's got one of those, you know, those bicycle things. Those bikes, you know, let's go for a bicycle ride, but we'll stay in the same place. Sitting over there, you know, it's a great idea. Lovely view and the whole thing. And then the island is there. And it has 8 sinks, which is absolutely necessary because we've all become Orthodox Jewish people, right? And we don't like our meat and our milk and things. You can understand in Israel if there's an explosion in islands, right? There are religious reasons. But we have the island for vanity. And then, of course, you look, and over in the corner, muttering to himself in Sanskrit, is the genius child. As anybody of you have children, you will know that everyone else's child is a genius. I don't know how it happened. And genius child is there with this effect called bloody Satanta or something. Or, you know, Lear or something mad. Like any name that predates Jesus by 2,000 years in any culture. Like I heard in Ballybrack, Ezekiel. Ezekiel, come in for your dinner. I believe you'll find it's in Leviticus, my chap. Anyway, so Satanta's there, right? The problem is we have to pay for all this stuff now, right? This is my point, right? But in humor, there are some serious points. So we have to pay for all these things, right? Ezekiel and Satanta have to pay for all these things. And we have this dilemma because we can't pay for it. And what is happening in Ireland is we have decided that the way we are going to deal with our past mistakes is to make more of them, right? Which is not smart, okay? We are now involved in an economic policy which is based on grinding down wages and grinding down employment and grinding down prices to such an extent that we want to regain the competitiveness that we lost, okay? Which makes sense. You need to be more competitive. But it makes no economic sense to pursue a policy of grinding down wages through deflation, okay? Because what is happening in the country, has anybody here got young children? All right, I have them, it's okay. You know, right, well, you might have noticed an outbreak of nits recently in schools, which didn't happen when I was a kid, right? You send your children in and you scrub them with tea tree oil, and then they go in and they're smelling lovely like a forest or something, and then they come back on this, scratching their head, right? So the thing about nits is if one kid gets nits in the school, the next kid gets the next kid's neuro, okay? But think about the way the economy works. If I decide that I'm not going to spend and I'm not confident because I think prices are falling, then you're not going to spend. Then you're not going to spend, then you're not going to spend, then you're not going to spend. And suddenly the expectations that prices are going to be cheaper tomorrow, called deflation, gets into the psyche. So everybody, rather than bringing forward spending, retracts spending. And this becomes psychological. And it's crucial to break that cycle. Otherwise, what happens in a country is that ultimately you simply end up spending less and less and less, and it means all the stabilizations of the government will fail. That's the cycle we're in. We have 6% deflation. It's the worst in Europe, and it seems to be getting worse in Ireland, okay? So, think about what we're doing is we're allowing unemployment to rise as the residual. Now, unemployment has always been something that one of the reasons I probably went into economics was because years and years ago, my father lost his job, which was not supposed to happen to families from around Monkstown and Dún Laoghaire. It didn't happen. And so much so that my dad, and I remember this as a 10-year-old, used to put on his suit and his tie and his coat and pretend to our neighbours that he was going to work. Every morning, got up at 7:30, left the house, pretending he was going to work because of the shame of unemployment. And I remember as a young boy, 10 years old, cycling to school, and Dad would cycle behind me. And when you're 10, you think this is fantastic because you've got your dad with you. But what made you feel delighted as a little boy that he'd be there to play football with you in the afternoon at home was killing him, right? So again, when I was a kid at 10, one afternoon, he said, listen, do you want to come with me? I have to give a message to somebody. And I said, fine. And he drove me to a place that I'd never been before. And I've subsequently found out when I went to Trinity and I used to walk around that it was a place called Werburgh Street. Werburgh Street had a big social welfare office, right? And it was about as far from our road in Monkstown and Dún Laoghaire as you could get. And my dad was signing on there because he was so ashamed of being unemployed in Dún Laoghaire that he might meet somebody in the welfare office. Now that has affected me as an individual profoundly. And maybe, in school I was always preferred maybe English and history, but I used to think, how can this economics game exist? How can good people be laid low by bad economics? Because it's always intrigued me, because if that was happening to my dad, it was happening to hundreds of thousands of dads and hundreds of thousands of families. And my mother and my father tried to protect, as you do with your children, you try to protect them. Now think about what's happening now in Ireland. We have seen our unemployment rate double. So that means all this strain and stress and emotional trauma and psychological trauma, as well as financial distress. But forget the finance. If you want to see the cost of this in our country, don't go and talk to economists, talk to doctors. I have friends of mine who are doctors in small towns and big towns around the country, and presenting to them every day are people of our age. I'm trying to ingratiate myself with you. People of our age. Anyway, younger, who are beginning to give up hope. And we in Ireland have to give everybody in this country a chance. We have to have an economic policy that gives us a chance. Because if we decide that we're going to grind down wages and prices and let unemployment rise, which is exactly what they're doing, right? We will destroy the country. We will destroy families. And we will have thousands and thousands of men like my dad living in shame. And this we cannot afford. And this is what people like Roosevelt figured out in America in the 30s. Roosevelt was advised to stay on the gold standard by all his advisors, and he said, no, the currency can change. This is the key, right? This is how we get back in. In Sweden and Finland, they had exactly the same dilemma we had in the early 90s. What did they do? They changed their currency. They dropped their currency. They changed it to make themselves more competitive. So rather than go through the 6 years or the 4 years of having a row with yourself and grinding down wages, you just drop them overnight. Like a company would, you change your prices, right? Finland, every single Asian tiger, every single one in the 1990s when I was working in investment banking, all, same problem, banks went mad, people bought property, usual carry on, they all dropped their exchange rates. They all changed fundamentally because in a radical situation, you've got to do radical things. And the interesting thing about Ireland is if anybody here, and I'm sure a lot of you have studied economics, right? Basic orthodox economics tells you that in a crisis of debt deflation, the way you get out of it is you change your currency. That's what the whole world, what is Obama doing? Mr. President, we've just borrowed another 100 billion, trillion, squillion from China. We'll just keep borrowing it and let the dollar drop because it's their fault now and their problem, okay? What is Britain doing? Britain is letting its currency fall. And if there's anything more nonsensical about Irish euro policy, it's a place called Newry. Newry is 50 miles away from here, okay? There was a program about the Berlin Wall the other night. I don't know if you saw George Lee, former colleague of mine, great guy, right? And he's making this program. There's a great image, and I presume there's some Germans here. There's a great image of the last bit of the wall before, it was put up. And there's like 2 or 3 yards, and fellas legging through the last bit of the wall, right? Doctors and lawyers getting out, right? And you think now, oh my God, that was so awful. Have you ever been to the border with Northern Ireland? Have you ever seen the queues of our Trabants, right, trying to get in to the north to shop? Because our currency is too bloody expensive. It will be regarded in the future as the biggest economic nonsense. They'll have black and white grainy photographs of us in our 4x4s, which you really need in Donnybrook because the mudslides are shocking. Swear the whole bits of Ranelagh just disappeared into the Dodder last night. Except for people with 4x4s. Anyway, going there, we are denuding our entire retail base for a currency which we only trade 20% in. We only do 20% of our trade in the euro. Right? So we have got this, we're prostrate on some ridiculous idea. And the reason is because I voted pro-European, I always do in all elections, right? I believe that we should accelerate political union in Europe, absolutely. And I believe Ireland should be part of that. But I also understand what's happening in Europe. Because what we have, I worked as a waiter in Boston, Massachusetts many years ago. And there was a thing called the Dukakis boom. When we were in college, we all went over there, pretended we had aunties in Yonkers. There was a fictitious aunt in Yonkers that we all went to. And so needless to say, we didn't go in illegally, or legally. And I was actually the only white English-speaking dishwasher ever. And I remember my Colombian associate who was with me, looked like Valderrama, remember the football player? Big fro on the man. And he just used to look at me, and he was so contemptuous, because you could just see going through his head is, you must be really thick if you're in here with us, and you're white and you speak English. And he was probably right. Anyway, but then, in Massachusetts, what happened was the economy collapsed, right? Same sort of carry on, cycles, booms, busts, all that. But once the economy collapsed in Massachusetts, the rest of the United States paid for the unemployment benefit of Massachusetts, okay? So what you get, and the people in Massachusetts migrated to California or to wherever it was booming, and you got this kind of thing called automatic stabilizers in economics, right? So your budget deficit doesn't go out of control because the rest of the federal republic pays. So what America has is a monetary union with a real political union, right? A proper political centralized government. We in Europe have a monetary union, and we're pretending. We're back to the good room again. We're pretending to have a government. So therefore what happens is in the booms are exacerbated, and in the busts are exacerbated. Because instead of the rest of Europe saying, okay, the paddies are in trouble, money should flow into Ireland, which is the objective. It's where we're going maybe next generation. But at the moment, we're not there yet. The European Union says, Ireland's in trouble, but you cut your budget deficit. But no economics says this. So at a time when the country is contracting, the official policy is to contract it even more, which makes no sense. So this is what I believe the radical option, but the only option is for us to step out of the good room and analyze where we're at and what we can possibly do. You take a country like Denmark. Denmark is in the European Union, very, very fully paid up member. It's not in the euro. Sweden's not in the euro. Britain's not in the euro. Czech Republic's not in the euro. Hungary's not in the euro. All the Baltic states are not in the euro. Do I have to say any more? It's not an anti-European argument. It's actually pro, because what I believe, and I've written in the book, obviously a lot of this stuff's in the book, but what I believe is that, and it's this NAMA thing, well, I've called it in the book Vietnama, right? That's why I'm not popular with the government. Anyway, it's a small town as well, which is really shocking. That's the worst thing. You can say, oh, this in America, and nobody ever see you again. In Ireland, you bump into everyone. But Vietnam, and think about what happened in Vietnam. The Americans threw everything they could at South Vietnam because they were operating in the Pentagon on an idea called the domino theory. You know, the idea that if Vietnam goes, Indonesia might go, Malaysia might go, Thailand, blah, 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 the big fear of communism. So we've got to stop communism wherever we find it with all our power, because that's how we prevent the dominoes falling. So eventually what the Americans end up doing is throwing all their hardware at South Vietnam, but not cognizant of the facts on the ground, not aware of what was actually going on in Vietnam, because the Pentagon's policy was a global view, rightly or wrongly. Okay, we won't get into that argument, right? But rightly or wrongly. ECB has the same view with Ireland. They are throwing all this money at us through NAMA, okay, which is a Frankenstein creature, God knows where it comes from, okay? But we can follow the dots in a minute. Not because they're concerned about us, but because they're concerned about the domino theory in the euro. That if a bank were to go bust in Ireland, it would be an embarrassment in the financial markets. Let's say that euro is only a shoddy currency. It allows banks to go bust. If a country goes bust, it's not because they're worried about us, but they're worried about the domino theory. They're worried about how it will play out in Washington, how it will play out in Beijing, how it will play out in London. So a bit like the Yanks, it wasn't out of love of South Vietnamese people that the Americans threw all their military hardware at Vietnam. And equally, it's not out of the love of the Irish. And what happened in Vietnam is the Americans lost anyway. And I believe that's what's going to happen here, that the banks will go bust anyway, or will be nationalized. And we'll end up have fought this stupid war, like we did in the devaluation, because we couldn't accept that we might be wrong, and we couldn't accept that by being weak, you're strong. When you admit that you make mistakes, you get stronger. All of us make mistakes every single day, and there's a dreadful thing. You make a mistake at work. Never happens here in Google, right? And your first instinctive reaction is, hide the Jesus thing. Because maybe they just won't see it, right? And you're kind of looking suspiciously at your neighbor. Like this. Remember in the copybooks doing your exams, right? Swatty fellas in class. No, you can't see the answer. But when you admit your mistake, it's when all the pressure goes. And you feel better about yourself, and somebody says, listen, actually, it's not a big deal. You are in trouble, and we in Ireland have to admit that. But we're pretending we're stronger than we are. And by pretending we're stronger than we are, nobody believes us. This is the crazy thing. Why are the financial markets fleeing from Ireland and charging us 5.7% for 15-year money, while they're charging Germany 3% in the same currency? Is because the financial markets believe that something is going to give here. Maybe this year, maybe next year. But the risk in Ireland is so big that they're not prepared to give us money at the same rates as they should do in the euro. So why don't, and I've got friends who work in the financial markets in London, very wide boys, they go, I can't believe it. I said, he says, you're fucking bankrupt. And you guys are paying me every single piece of the bet I made. The guys in London can't believe that we are paying them back. Right? And the reason is very simple, because business is business. If you win some, you do well. I presume it happens in lots of Google initiatives. It's going great, and then it hits the buffers, and you lose, and you park that idea, and you go on to something else. And you have a contingency for, ideas that don't work, and you try to make sure that the ideas that work are substantially more, or at least more, than the ideas that don't. And you move on. That's the way the markets work. So the financial markets have already made provisions for their losses in the Irish banks. But we can't understand that. Because we believe that if we admit to the mistakes of the past, that we will be crippled. But what happened in every country that has admitted the mistakes? All the Asian tigers recovered straight away. Okay? Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, all banks failed, recovered straight away. Financial markets are forward-looking, not backward-looking. They want to say, what's the next gig? Exactly like yourselves at work. You can't dwell on your mistakes. You learn from them and you move on. And the book argues strongly, and that's, I suppose, why it's created a lot of, maybe also eating garlic with the finance minister was. But anyway, or saying something in prime time, which is very stupid. But I come back to the ideas, right? Even that prime time thing, in 2003, I went on prime time, and I said that the Irish economy was strong in certain areas, like here, in this area, but it was weak in other areas. And the areas that were weak were going to predominate. And they are going to be, and I said that the property market wasn't a sign of strength, but was a sign of weakness. And I said on TV that it was a scam perpetrated by developers, bankers, and the government to extract money from the people, which I believe it was. Back to the idea. Ridicule, then violently opposed, then we all knew it was a bleeding scam, right? Okay? And this idea will be the same because this idea is pure. It's what economics tells you to do. And we in Ireland have to realize that if we don't do something like this, we are going to find a generation, your generation, will be hamstrung by the mistakes of a different generation. And this country can actually do almost anything once we admit we're wrong and once we change. You know, I believe that this country, what has happened in Google here in Ireland, and lots and other of our multinational corporations, could be multiplied tenfold. Because the key to it is to have a country that is a pleasant enough place to live, that is open for business, that's open to foreign talent, and that ultimately plugs itself into, at a competitive price, the world market. This is the key, right? This is what we have to achieve in Ireland, what we should consistently be trying to achieve, because I think we can steal a march on many of our competitors if we just get back to first principles. Now, and to do that, we have got to sort out some of the mess that we've made in an adult fashion. Because at the moment we're kind of being very adolescent. It's like being in trouble with your ma. Have you noticed that? Right? The reaction is like rather like when you're an adult, like and you get caught doing something, you fess up and you say, okay, let's deal with it. But when you're a child, you say, no, it wasn't me. No. And we've decided that we're pretending our banks are fine, and we're pretending that companies can expand. And we're pretending we can have a strong currency when we're weak. But we can't. And it reminds me, the way Ireland should do is, does anybody remember slow sets? Okay. Does anybody remember Wesley? This is very local knowledge. It'll be passed on in the canteen of Google for those. See, I have red hair. So I have a pathological fear of the slow set. Right? Because red-haired boys didn't get lucky at slow sets. We lived in fear of the lights coming on. And she'd go, oh my God, he's got red hair. Right? And they'd flee away as if you'd done something to them. Right? I still, as a mature man with children and a happy marriage, break out in a cold sweat at the opening bars of Spandau Ballet's True. Because I go back to Wesley, and the big red fro sticking out, right? But there were friends of mine, good friends of mine, who, there was two types of people, and then us Newtons, the Redzers, okay, at the disco, right? There was the wallflowers, who when Spandau Ballet came on, all disappeared. And then there were these people who changed. And they were quite normal before the slow set, and then they turned into flirts. They just had it, right? Friends of mine, like blokes, just big fin, up, boop, 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 right? Girls, friends of mine, who just batty, right? Okay? Just batty all over the place, right? And we, of course, the Redzers were removed on grounds of good taste. Put out the back, say, there's 10 major and a flagon. Now sit out there for a while. Now, but just think what I'm trying to say. Think about the world economy and a country like Ireland, right? At the slow set, nobody really had a comparative advantage, right? Because it was a bit dark and grubby and sweaty, okay? So the flirts did amazingly well, right? I have a friend of mine who I'm glad to say now is a little bit rotund and follicularly challenged, okay? But when he was 16, he was gorgeous. And on our inter-cert results night, which is junior cert to you, our inter-cert result night, he got about 6 snogs. Like I was halfway back to Dunleary on the 8 bus at this stage, right? He got snogs you'd bring home to your ma, snogs you wouldn't go near the garden gate with. He Protestant snogs which counted for 2. True or false? Oh, okay. So what was he doing? He was flirting. He was making himself known on the marketplace that was the slow set. Now think about all our companies, or us as individuals, right? And then their companies, right? There's nothing really going on here that the competition won't try to steal. There's nothing going on, let's say in Ireland at Aer Lingus, that won't be copied by Ryanair or vice versa. There's nothing going on at Bank of Ireland, well there actually is nothing going on at Bank of Ireland, but that won't be done in AIB. You think about it, like all companies, you get this little comparative advantage for a while, and then your competitors notices you, and boom, you're gone, right? So it's like a big slow set. Nobody has a comparative advantage except for the flirts. So the key for all of us in the new marketplace, when Ireland recovers, and it will, whether it's a company or an individual, is how do you do things differently that people want to pay you more than they pay the competition? That's all it's about. Because when you come up with a good idea, somebody else will come up with it. You have a good idea, somebody else will just do it. Now, it reminds me, about 4 or 5 weeks ago, I met a very, very swanky friend of mine. She's very sophisticated, and she is one of those people who knows the difference between fennel and fenugreek, which is obviously something you need to know in your early 40s, because I'm like a girl talking about the offside rule when it comes to food, right? I'm a man who lives exclusively on hula hoops and Mars bars. And any content of an Esso garage is fine by me, right? But my friends have got all sophisticated and they talk about food now, right? And this girl the other day, a few months ago, I met her and she goes, "Hello, David, lovely to see you." She said, "Well, where did you go on your holidays?" And I said, "Oh, we went to Spain and it was great and the kids were fine and there was other couples like us and there was a swimming pool. It's all great, isn't it, boring?" And she was like recoiling. I said, "Well, where did you go?" Which is what she wanted me. She goes, "Well, I went to Uzbekistan." Uzbekistan? Yes, that's very far away. She said, "Well, that's the point." And she said, "And last night, just before we came home, myself and Jerry were up on the top of the Atlas Mountains under the full moon, eating pine nuts with nomadic tribesmen." Now, what she was actually saying was, you who go to Spain are a knacker. This is what she didn't say it, but this is what it was in her head. I am a piney, nutty, nomadic-y type of person, right? Okay, that's me, that's my tribe, okay? And you are beneath contempt, okay? Now the point is, somebody has got into her head that if she's a nomadic, tribesy, piney, nutty type of person in that particular tribe, okay, somebody has convinced her that that will actually make her feel better about life, okay? And has made her 7 grand lighter as a result, okay? Because you can't fly in a charter to Uzbekistan, which is the whole point, okay? Somebody's flirted with her head and got right inside her head to change the way she perceives herself. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we all have to do. So irrespective of whether we in Ireland go through a grinding recession or whether we take the dramatic move that everybody else has taken by changing our currency, which is dramatic, for all of us, whether it's in Google or individually, to get on, you've got to go back to the slow set. Put on Spandau Ballet's True. It's not a good tune, really, to be caught in your iPod, but anyway, put it on. We've all got to flirt. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, guys, if anybody has any questions, the podiums are open.
Go for it. Who was the first question on Spandau Ballet and important things like that?
Hi, David. How are you?
Good.
What advice would you give for entrepreneurs in this deep and dark economic time?
Well, I suppose in many ways, I'm kind of an entrepreneur myself. Like, you work for yourself and you create your own stuff and you hope to sell it in the marketplace. Just keep doing it. People asked me the other day, I'm presenting the panel. Right? The panel is a comedy show. I'm a straight man, economist. And they said, "Why are you presenting the panel?" And I said, "Because I do stuff. And that's what I do in life. You get up and say, what are we going to do today?" What are we going to, how are we going to earn a crust? And so I believe that what is out, it doesn't matter what's happening up there. It really doesn't matter what's happening in the banks or whatever. That is a credit constraint, right? That's all it is. But it's what's in here. It's the power of ideas that changes everything. And it's how you convince people and change and cajole and taking risks. So I think that, if you take it from a macroeconomic view and costs are falling, some people would say it's a good thing. But I don't think the environment for us has changed at all. You just do stuff in different environments. So if, like, for example, the way I look at it is that people say, do the panel. I said, yeah, do it. And enjoy it. So I think what happens in Ireland is there's this extraordinary thing that we've got to fix we have to fix the big things. But if we wait until we fix the big, it's like in Google. I mean, I presume you don't wait around for direction from on high to do stuff. And this is what I think is the sort of environment that you've created here. If we could replicate that outside, it is going to be difficult. Taxes are going to rise here dramatically. Ain't no doubt of that. Okay, social welfare is probably going to be cut. All these big macro indicators. The education budget's going to be cut. I just do things like, the reason I tried to put the Farmley thing together, the diaspora thing in Farmley, was like, keep people back in and try and get ideas going. So I would just say it hasn't changed. Really, it's all about up here. And it's all about expressing ourselves. And yeah, it's a bit more difficult. And I don't want to lay off people, so we're trying to do all sorts of jiggery-pokery to make sure that we can keep people in. It's a small company I have. But I don't see, apart from the credit crunch, I don't see any change at all in Ireland. And I think we've all got to see that.
Thank you.
By the way, my CV for a job in Google is just here. If you take it, Ken. I can do lots of shit. Go for it.
Many people are very annoyed about the government's decision to nationalise Anglo. Many people feel it should have been just allowed to collapse because of the corruption and so on. What do you say to that?
Okay, about 15 months ago, 14 months ago, I had this unusual occurrence, which is in the book, which is detracted from the book because it's where the minister came to my house to chat about stuff. And what had happened was I'd gone on a radio program with them, and I said the banks were going to go bust in this country, and that's our big problem. And he said, oh, you can't talk, that's dangerous talk. Now, I actually felt a lot of sympathy for him, because if he even thought that the banks were going to bust, he couldn't, as the minister, say that. But, I was watching his body language and the leader of the opposition and finance spokesman, Richard Bruton, and they really believed the banks were fine. So that was on the 6th of September. And I kept writing that the banks would be in trouble, not because I knew anything about what was going on in the banks, but because I knew about economics and cycles and what happens, right? And I'd seen it. I'd seen it in Argentina, I'd seen it in Serbia, I'd seen it in Israel, all these places I worked, I'd seen it in Russia, same carry on, right? And then, I went on prime time, and again, the same thing. Government spokespeople coming out, central bank, saying the banks are fine. And I was like, the dogs in the street know they're bust. We're going to lose all our deposits because these guys have been so cavalier with their own finance that they won't give a damn if they drag all the deposits with them on a run in the bank. That was my thing. So that's, I suppose, why, when the minister arrived in my house, we were discussing this, and I thought, not just me, but some other people, not lots of other people, thought that a full guarantee, which is what the Swedes had done in '92, might work. And the argument was, well, what about Anglo? Even back then, if you guarantee Anglo, are you not guaranteeing something that you can't unravel? And my argument was that at the time, and it's in the book, and it's still what I make, was that the guarantee prevented a run in our banks. And it was incredibly successful as a policy. It now runs out on the 1st of October of next year, 28th of September of next year. So what we should be doing now with the likes of Anglo, okay, is saying to the creditors of Anglo, those of you lucky enough to have very short-term paper with Anglo covered by the guarantee, we'll pay you. But that's a fraction of the total Anglo liability creditors. The rest of you, we can give you 100% today, but we're not going to give you that because you know the markets are liquid. But if you wait for this time next year, you'll get zero because the bank is bust. Now, what do you want to do? You should start negotiating with the creditors under the terms of the guarantee because they're stuck. And I come back to the guys in London who can't believe that we as a nation are going to spend 28 billion of NAMA money on Anglo, which is a basket case. So we've got to go back to first. Use the guarantee so that my mother and your deposits don't fly out, so you don't have a run on the bank. And then negotiate with the creditors. And what you should do with something like Anglo is go to someone like AIB and say, do you want the deposit book of Anglo? Because there is a deposit book there. Sell that little bit off, and then do what you do if a sweet shop went bust. You deal with everyone, and creditors take 10 cents on the dollar, and you start again. And what you could then do, I think, with AIB, which I think will also be in dire situation, is go to, let's say, a bank I used to work for, BNP Paribas. And I'm just using this as an example, right? All the French banks, substantially well managed during the boom. They have no problems. And basically say, do you want AIB for free? We'll give it to you. We'll give you the branch network. We'll give you the deposit base. What you do is you give the old creditors BNP paper at a heavy discount. And we, as the Irish state, will act as a broker in the deal. Not a principal, as a broker. We bring the buyer and the seller together, and away we go. That's what you would do in a normal company. But what has happened is, I think, that the lads are in power and they're protecting themselves because it makes no sense at all. People are right to be angry because you could wind down Anglo creatively with modest cost to the taxpayer and maximum payment extract from the creditors. I can't see why. But they're all mates. And there is a horrible feeling in Ireland. At the very top, it's a very small bunch of individuals. And if it happened in Serbia, you'd be shocked. But this is Ireland, and it's happened. And it's happening.
Hi, David.
Hiya.
In the early 90s, when the savings and loans banks in the US went bust, the federal government set up a company called the Realty Trust Corporation to deal with it, similar to NAMA. And so in the last year when we've been discussing NAMA, I've heard nothing about similar structures
REITs.
Anywhere. Yeah, so I'm wondering, and we've had Brian Lenihan in here, we had Colin McCarthy in here, and I just see a big disconnect of expertise. And then people like Colin McCarthy coming out with reports, other experts from different countries who have been through these experiences before. And it seems that nobody's learning from mistakes and expertise in other places. And I'm just wondering why that is, and why can we not?
Well, I think you're onto the crux of the issue, right? What I would like to, if in Google, I'll answer about the REITs in a second, but a more general point. Like, let's say, for example, in Google, you never have a problem, but tell me, like, let's say there's a problem in the company and you need a solution. How do you arrive at the solution? Because what I'm saying is that in the civil service, if we're faced with a problem, they retract the advice base, right? So instead of having the self-confidence to, like open source, to say, we need to get all the brains involved and we need to do it in 2 weeks because we don't have time. But in that 2 weeks, we're going to talk to everybody. We're going to take advice. We're going to look at other countries. That's what I presume adult people do, right, when you're faced with a dilemma. In our country, in the civil service, and I've noticed it, and, they've said a lot of quite nasty things about me, but that's neither here nor there, but it's indicative of a mentality that is, instead of throwing and opening the problem, they contract, and therefore, I think, get the wrong answer. And then once they contract, it's very difficult to go back on this. And this is to do with the psychology, it's to do with the illusion of power, right? That the illusion of power is that by being powerful, by having the badge that says, I am the Minister for Finance, that you will undermine the mystique of that power by ventilating your problems. And I believe that the way successful companies and individuals work is the opposite. That we have a problem, let's see what the best practice. What's best practice? What happened the best way? So you have something like REITs. The other problem is, think about it. What we need in the Department of Finance is a trader with a mentality of a trader, okay? What we have are lawyers, civil service, and academic economists. And what's put the three of them together? They have never taken one risk in their lives. So they don't understand risk. But we're dealing in risk. So I think it would be much better to get traders who say, okay, well, the way the market works is, like you take the way the savings and loans is, the bundles of loans drop in price to maybe 10 cents in the dollar, okay? And then they begin to trade and work their way out. It's taken off the balance sheet and you start again. That's simple stuff. but it seems to be far too difficult to do. So I think it's to do with an inability to see the world in an open source way.
If that's it, thank you very much,
The
David
book is
McWilliams.
fantastic, by the way. It's called Follow the Money. Thank you very much. Cheers, Ken. That was great fun.